My name is Sailesh. I'm a barrister. I also sit as a part-time judge in the Crown Court. I was born in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, when it was a British colony. I then moved to India at the age of 1. I lived in a village in Gujarat, and it was a village in the middle of a desert, and so water was very scarce. And one of my early childhood memories is queuing up at the well with my mother in the hot midday sun, and she would then come back with my help, of course, with 5 or 6 gourds, containers of water, and that's how we survived. So that's my early childhood memory from India. I then came to the UK when I was about 6 years old. I spoke only Gujarati, which is an Indian language. I spoke no English. And so I learnt English as a second language in this country. And I learnt English from the TV. And in those days, the TV mainly had proper received English, which is why I speak with the accent that I do. It was purely learnt from TV, which made it a little difficult when I was at school, because I was in a school where I was brought up in a council estate. And so I went to a local school where I was one of the first non-white persons to be there. And that was an interesting school, because there was a history of no one ever attending university from that school. At that stage, my mum worked in a factory. I used to go and work with her every holidays, and I believed that that was going to be my future, that I would end up working in a factory, as did many of my friends from school. And then luckily for me, my older brother, who was only 2 years older than me, decided to apply to university. And he was the first person in the history of that school to get to university. And as a result, everyone that I knew in my year and the year above me decided, well, if my brother could do it, they too could have an escape route away from the factory. So I applied to university. I applied to do a law degree. At that stage, I hadn't decided that I could be a lawyer. In fact, everything suggested that I couldn't be. I was satisfied in my limited knowledge that I was the wrong colour, the wrong class, the wrong background to ever become a lawyer, and certainly could never even imagine becoming a barrister. The purpose of doing a law degree was really because I felt I was too young to decide what the future held for me. When you're 17, I think that's too young to decide your whole future. And the advantage of a law degree was that it was a good base from which to do many other possible things. So I went to Manchester University, which was a good red brick university in those days. And I was lucky to get the right A-level results to get into university. And it was during that 3-year degree course that my interest and love of law developed. The love of law being really a foundation in human rights, in the rule of law, and how law is really a tool to achieve what you want to achieve. It's a tool for fairness, it's a tool for equality, and that's what enthused me during my 3 years. But I still wasn't convinced that I could ever be a barrister, let alone achieve any modicum of success. So I decided what many youngsters in my position did. We were still living in a council house. My brother and I had to get us out of the gutter that we lived in as far as we were concerned. And so he joined a chartered accountancy firm, one of the best in the world, Arthur Andersen's, and I joined a middle-sized chartered accountancy firm, because that's the only firm that would take me on. But unfortunately for me, in the first week of chartered accountancy, I realised that nothing I ever did added up, no figures ever reconciled. I was possibly the worst ever chartered accountant in the history of accountancy. And so I decided that this was not going to be a career for me, and my fear was that I would look back on my life at the age of 70 and have a regret that I did not try to join the bar. And so this is what I decided, that I would leave accountancy, I would do 1 year at bar school, I would fail miserably, and then I'd go back to accountancy. And that way, when I was 70 years old, I'd look back on my life and think, at least I tried and failed, rather than never having tried at all. So I left accountancy, joined bar school, and amazingly, I passed the exam. even more amazingly, I persuaded or cajoled my way to, with my inn, to be given a scholarship. And so I got a Sir Thomas More scholarship, which allowed me then to get pupillage. And pupillage in those days was much easier to achieve than it is now. But of course, I couldn't just go for a pupillage in an average set, because I knew this was going to be my last year. So I may as well enjoy myself. So I applied to the biggest and most famous criminal set in the country, the Hollis Whiteman Chambers. It used to be called the Factory in those days. And surprisingly, for me as well as for the chambers I applied to, I was taken on as a pupil. I was the first non-white pupil to be taken on at the Factory. And for me, it was a huge experience, but I'd like to think it was an experience for them as well, because everyone else was almost entirely white, male, and probably from only 2 or 3 schools in the country, Rugby or Winchester being the 2 key public schools, and they all almost exclusively were from Oxford or Cambridge. So I was a complete anomaly and almost an experiment. And as you might expect, of the 11 pupils, of whom I was one, there came a stage fairly early on when I was elected the leader of the pupils. And again, because it was going to be my last year, I'd fail miserably as a pupil, I would have to go back. So I decided that I would take on the role of leader and that we would have fun. And so all the pupils in my year decided we would not be competing with each other, but we would just have fun. And so that's how I spent my first year as a pupil in one of the top sets in the country. And the clerk of Hollis Whiteman Chambers, for some reason, got on very well with me and decided to give me cases that were far beyond my ability or experience. And so I was doing some fairly big cases, certainly for me, as a young, snotty-nosed pupil, far in excess of what I should be doing. But what the effect of that was that it made me into a much harder human being. Because when you're thrown into the deep end in the criminal law, and there are judges, many of whom I'm sure wondered whether I could speak English, wondered whether I possessed the right ingredients, the right character to be a barrister, then it's a toughening up process. You either sink or swim. So I was very grateful to be given those cases. And in fact, every judge that attacked me or slighted me or was rude to me, it just made me stronger. Because my view is, and this is what I tell my pupils, is that it is a tough profession. It is not for softies. And of course that must be right, because the sort of people that I represent, they don't want a softie. They want someone that can look after themselves as well as the client that I have. And so it was a useful toughening up process. And again, luckily, amazingly, I survived that year. And I was then taken on as a tenant. I applied to a small left-wing militant set of barristers' chambers, where the head of chambers would often be seen outside the High Court burning his wig and gown in protest at the latest unfairness or injustice that had happened. And so I joined a maverick group of chambers, a group of barristers, all 12 of us, with no practice at all. And the head of chambers said, "I can't give you work, but what I'll give you is a desk and a telephone, and then you're on your own." And so in those early years, every time someone had 2 cases, couldn't do both of them, they'd give me their hand-me-down cases. And my job was to do it as well as I could and try to impress the solicitor. And so over the years, it took quite a few years, I built up a practice. And slowly but surely, I started doing better and better cases. And so you may ask, well, how did I come to do environmental law and some of the more esoteric work that I do, such as fire law and health and safety law? Well, my opening came completely by chance. And much of my career is based on lucky breaks. So amongst the 11 pupils that I mentioned that I became the leader of, one of the pupils was a little older than all of us, was a little more awkward, one might say, but I insisted that he should join us everywhere we went. When that pupil left, he joined the fire brigade. And one of the first things he did was to instruct me, even though I knew nothing about fire law. So I'd go for conferences with him, and the other lawyers would ask, who is this Sailesh Mehta? Every time he comes, it feels like there's a party going on in your room. Is he any good? And my friend lied and said, yeah, he's good. It's worth giving him some work. And in those days, the fire brigade and the Environment Agency shared lawyers. So I then got my first environmental case as a result of that. And so again, as I said, my whole career is peppered with luck. And because of the luck of that pupil that I treated well, who then left and joined the fire brigade, where the lawyers intermingled with Environment Agency lawyers, that's how I then end up with an environmental practice as well as a criminal practice. And so over the years, my work developed, and as one's name gets known, and as the newspapers started picking up on my cases, and my cases got reported more and more, then of course I got bigger and better work. And so that's how I end up to be where I am in Red Lion Chambers, which is one of the big and well-known chambers in the country. Our ex-head of chambers is now the Director of Public Prosecutions. We've had two Attorney Generals from our set. Margaret Thatcher, who used to be a pupil in the set that I'm at, although my political affiliation is not entirely in accord with hers. But that gives you an idea of the range of people that we have. At the moment, Red Lion Chambers is about 100 in number, so we're a fairly large criminal set, and we've got about 15 ex-judges who are also affiliated with our chambers. And so, for example, the COVID inquiry that's about to take place, the head of that COVID inquiry is an ex-member of our chambers who's also now re-affiliated as an ex-High Court judge. So that gives you a rough idea of the background of my chambers. So I can tell you the who and the what of what drove me to become a barrister. The who comprises of a number of people. So I could, for example, tell you about my grandfather. He used to dress me up as a barrister when I was 5 years old, and everyone laughed at the fact that he dressed me up as a lawyer. And part of the reason for the laughter was that I used to run away from school. And so I couldn't read or write, even though all my contemporaries in India knew maths and knew how to read and write. I used to run away. My grandmother used to hide me in her house when my mum came looking for me, because she'd heard from the teacher that I kept on running away. And so I used to hide in a little cubby hole in my grandmother's house. But my granddad was the first inspiration. He was a gentle, thoughtful, polite man who believed in equality, and equality for women as well as men, which in that day and age was very unusual, and impressed on me the need for fairness and treating everyone as an equal. And I learned that from the way he treated everyone else, even though the caste system in my village was prevalent. And I saw how he treated everyone, even the poor that used to come to our house, in the same polite, careful manner that he treated the richest people that used to come for advice to him. And so he himself was like an informal advocate for the community that I lived in. I could also say that Mahatma Gandhi was an inspiration to me. Gandhi, as it happens, grew up in my part of India, where the Jains were. That Jainism is a tiny religion that I grew up in. And it's a religion based entirely on non-violence, and that's where Mahatma Gandhi gets his principles from. And it's funny how these things come back, because years later I discovered that Gandhi was a member of Inner Temple, and I've actually been to Inner Temple and been shown the papers in which he was disbarred. The benches of Inner Temple had a meeting to disbar the great Mahatma Gandhi, who had just recently been convicted in India of sedition. And even though the benchers knew that the charge of sedition was unfairly levelled at Gandhi, and that therefore the sentence was unfair, they still felt obliged to disbar him. So that was another of my influences. But there are numbers, even colleagues of mine, even pupils of mine have been inspirations to me, because there is something you can learn from everyone, including my clients. So that's the who of the inspiration. The why. I suppose one of my formative events, when I lived in a council house in the estate, our house used to be attacked by racists. On their way after the pub closed, they'd break our windows, and my brother and I would chase them with our cricket bats and our cricket stumps. And those are the days when you could still do that without having a gun pulled on you. And my mum would be frantic and would phone the police. And we didn't even have a phone in our house in those days. She'd have to run to a phone booth at midnight to call the police. And the police would come, if they came at all, 1 or 2 hours later. And as often as not, they would search our house for drugs, even though we were the ones that had called the police to protect us. And so there was that sense of unfairness, injustice that may well have been instilled in me, that resulted in me wanting to make sure that that did not continue. And so that's one of, I suppose, the features that might have influenced the way that I came to the bar. And when I did come to the bar, I then did quite a lot of pro bono work for groups to make sure that racism did not persist. I was an advisor to a group that used to patrol the East End estates against racism. And invariably, the police would arrest them rather than the racists that they were trying to protect the community against. So there have been a number of formative experiences in my life. But the thread, I suppose, is fairness, equality of treatment and justice that bring me to the bar, which may account for why a lot of my work is human rights oriented. And I was one of the founding members of the Bar Human Rights Committee. There were 4 of us who decided we'd set up the committee. My good friend, who's a roommate of mine, contacted the chairman of the Bar Council saying, we think there should be a human rights committee. Eventually, the chairman got so fed up and wrote to him using some expletive, saying, well, if you think you can do it, then why don't you set one up yourself? So we decided to take up the challenge, and 4 of us set up the Bar Human Rights Committee. And we decided that we would actually have a number of international ventures, the first of which internationally was to Malawi to visit 2 of Africa's longest serving prisons of conscience after Nelson Mandela. Orton Chirwa and Vera Chirwa, his wife, had been imprisoned in Malawi for the mere fact of asking for a little bit more freedom. And so our first mission abroad, I was the youngest in that mission, we went to Malawi and we persuaded the live president to allow us access to see Orton and Vera. We were the first Western visitors to see this imprisoned couple for 15 years, and they themselves had not seen each other for 12 of those 15 years. And we insisted that they should be allowed to see each other. They'd been imprisoned in the same prison, and it was a heartbreaking experience. And I'm pleased to say that 3 years after that fateful visit by the Bar Human Rights Committee, Vera Chirwa came to my house when she was released and stayed in my house and stayed on the most comfortable bed that we could offer her in the spare bedroom. When my spouse, when my other half went to knock on Vera's door, she came running to me saying, Vera's not in her room, her bed's not been slept in. We ran into her room and found that she was sleeping under the bed. Because she said that she felt safer and the hard surface of the floorboards was what she was accustomed to, having slept on a concrete floor for the last 15 years of her life before she was released. And so that was a pleasure and a privilege to see someone that we had been instrumental in seeing in Malawi. So that's an example of how human rights can have a positive effect. And also, I suppose it's an example of how I can be quite bloody-minded, that I won't take no for an answer. And even though everyone was saying, you'll never get to Malawi, the life president will never allow you access, you'll never see these prisoners. Because I was naive and I was big-headed and bloody-minded, I decided, so what? And we went and we did achieve it. And I suppose that's a lesson that any young barrister should keep with them, that however many people say, no, you can't do it, no, the odds are against you, no, you're the wrong colour or the wrong sex, etc. The answer is, well, thank you very much for that advice, but I'm still going to do what I want to do. And that sort of person, if they've got the grit and the persistence, then they increase the prospects of their success significantly, particularly in a profession like mine. You've got to have that self-belief, and you've got to sometimes, I'm afraid, ignore what may be well-meaning and good advice. If you want to come to the bar, if you want to become a lawyer, do it, and don't let anyone put you off. That's the mantra that I followed. I was lucky enough that I managed to through the help of friends, beat the odds against me. But I think that helps you in making the odds a little better in your favour, that sort of mentality. So I have been approached about going to politics many years ago, and certainly shortly before the Blair government. My difficulty is this, that even though I was very tempted, and it would have been quite an interesting new aspect of a career that was developing at the bar, my fear was that I'd probably end up as a backbencher, that I don't think I've got it in me to compromise. And the difficulty when you're an MP, particularly a young MP, is that to make your career, there have to be compromises. There have to be compromises of some principles. And my worry is that a lot of politicians, when they're young, say, look, my end is to do some good, but in the route to that end, I will make some compromises. And when I get there, then I will rediscover my original principles. My own slightly bitter experience of having seen others do it is that by the time you get to that end, you forget what your principles are. And so my own worry was that I couldn't and didn't want to compromise, and therefore I would end up a backbencher. And my view is that I can do far more good as a barrister, as a human rights lawyer, doing a case one at a time, writing articles, doing other things, my pro bono cases, being part of the Bar Human Rights Committee and other committees that I'm a member of, doing that than as a backbench MP. During COVID, when there was the odd spare moment, a friend of mine, a plastic surgeon, he himself set up a society. It's now become the second biggest society of plastic surgeons in the UK. And as his society was growing, he turned to me for advice and for assistance, which I provided pro bono. And there are now about 150 members of his group. One of the many things that his group do is pro bono free work, particularly involving children. So they run camps in India, in Ghana, in Bangladesh, involving cleft palate surgery for the poor. So when I was asked, where do you think we should do our next camp, my immediate response was Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where I was born. And they thought that was a good idea. So I've just, in fact, returned from a trip to Tanzania with some plastic surgeons. It was really just to meet the right people and to see if there was a need, and if there was a need, whether we could satisfy the need. Well, we met up with the health minister of Zanzibar, who is very keen that there should not only be a camp for cleft palate surgery and burn surgery in Zanzibar, but that we should do it in a way that's sustainable. And so we've agreed that we will take a team of surgeons next year, and it won't be just a one-off project. It'll be part of a 5-year project, so that not only do we assist the local poor people, particularly children, but also that we will train the local surgeons. And so we will run a 7-day camp in Zanzibar. We hope to run a 5-day camp in Dar es Salaam, the capital, where there's a teaching hospital. And the purpose is for the plastic surgeons to operate in Dar es Salaam, but also to teach the local surgeons, so that there is some sustainability, so that they themselves can then go to Zanzibar and practice there to help for cleft palate and also other aspects of plastic surgery. And so I'm pleased that I'm not only involved but actively involved, and I've been asked to become a director of that particular project. I suppose my perfect day would involve doing work. Because for me, what I do at the bar isn't really work in the way that other people might see work. For me, it is a way of living. It's a vocation rather than a job. And so an ideal work would be an appearance in court, perhaps a court of appeal, a conference in a knotty, difficult case, followed by a meeting with one of my pro bono charities. And of course, a dinner with friends over a glass of wine, discussing the day. That would be my perfect day, I suppose. My favourite artist, it depends on which day you ask me and what time of the day you ask me. So I've recently come back from Paris about 3 weeks ago, shortly before I went to Tanzania. And of course I saw the Monet exhibition at the Orangerie. And Monet, as an impressionist artist, is one of my favourites. And particularly at the Orangerie, where huge Monet paintings, floor-to-ceiling size paintings, and you can just almost dive into the pond and the lily pads that Monet painted. It is one of my favourite galleries in the world, but also surrounded by one of my favourite painters. Can I also tell you about another of my favourite artists, Caravaggio. Caravaggio, who was a proper artist who would at the slightest taunt take up a sword and have a sword fight, who had to run away having been pursued for murdering someone, but then was pardoned by the Pope. So an artist who lived by the seat of his pants and suffered for his art as well. You also asked me about my favourite food. So when I'm asked what treat I want, whether it should be a Michelin-starred restaurant, invariably I prefer a small family-run restaurant with street food. These, of course, tend to be fairly cheap, and so some of my friends hate asking me that question because they know that they won't get a posh meal in the company of posh friends. But my favourite would be a very down-to-earth local family-run restaurant, ideally Italian. I'm a vegetarian, and even though I'm not religious, I still maintain that central tenet from the religion that I was brought up in, Jainism, which is an interesting religion because it's one of the few religions without a god. It's a non-theistic religion. It's more a way of life than a religion, very similar to Buddhism. And so, as I say, I'm not religious, but I still maintain that central tenet of vegetarianism, which also chimes in with the environmental work that I do. So one of the first environmental cases that I prosecuted in was about 25 years ago. This was a time when environmental law was the sort of Cinderella of the profession. No one wanted to do it because it didn't pay very much, it wasn't seen as fashionable. Judges hated it, and so I'd have an environmental case in a Crown Court, and judges invariably said, why is this case even in my court? Shouldn't this be a civil case rather than a criminal case? That was the view then. Over the last 25 years, I and a few of my colleagues were duty-bound to change that view. Now I go into a court with an environmental case, and judges embrace the case. And so we have been part of the change. And of course, society's changed as well. There's been a steady movement towards embracing the environment. And certainly in the last 10 years, I, with a couple of colleagues, have moved the law in relation to the international movement of our waste. The way the West has produced unfeasible amounts of waste, ranging from plastics to electronic waste to clothing. And of course, there is money to be made in that waste, and so huge sea containers get exported. TVs that don't work, video players that don't work, waste plastics that should never be exported go abroad. And so we have been involved in a series of cases in the Crown Court as well as in the Court of Appeal to move the law to try to stop that sort of export of our waste. And so I, with particularly one colleague of mine, Howard McCann, have been in the Court of Appeal at least 4 times in the last 10 years to change the way that the law is administered and to clarify the law relating to the movement of international movement of waste. And so I feel fairly pleased that as a result of all of those cases, the export of our sometimes toxic waste to Nigeria, to Ghana, to India, to Indonesia, to China in particular, and particularly the plastic waste that often gets burnt in the local area that can then cause cancer clusters near where it's burnt. All of that has diminished greatly, and that the law has been clarified significantly in the last few years. My favourite colour is turquoise. And the background to that, I think, is that my favourite coloured toy in India was turquoise. And it's funny how these things stay with you over the years. And so, in fact, I've just had my wall decorated, and as the copper in the wall slowly ages, it will become slightly turquoise. So I've got a son who's 27 years old. He's an only child. He's an advert for a one-child family. He is very mischievous, and he knows more about the world at this tender age than I ever will know. He became much wiser than he should be at a very young age. But we're now more friends than father and son, and so he and I talk about the law, the politics, everything. And one of the things that I'm pleased about is that he tells me that he's learnt quite a bit from me. He's learnt about resilience, he's learnt about fairness of treatment, and so he's seen how when he was brought up as he was a youngster, how we treated others, from our clients to people in the restaurant to my peers. So during the COVID period, I took up cycling big time. So I still cycle regularly. I go to the gym. I love meeting friends and having a glass of wine over a good meal. I decided to become a part-time judge, which is known as a recorder. Some years ago, I had started getting more and more serious cases, and I was approached by a senior judge as to whether I might be interested. And luckily, just at that stage, becoming a judge had stopped being just a matter of being tapped on the shoulder, and exams had started. So for the first time, judges were appointed based on what they knew rather than who they knew. And so I decided I would apply to become a part-time judge. Luckily sat through the exams and got through, including the practical exams. And so I decided to become a recorder. It's a part-time judge in the Crown Court where I do trials. And as I become more senior as a part-time judge, I can do more and more serious cases. But what I've learned sitting as a judge is the art of advocacy. I believed until I became a recorder that I knew everything there was to know about advocacy. Then I decided to sit as a judge, and I realized all of my weaknesses, all of my frailties, because they were reflected in the very barristers who were in front of me. And I recognized those weaknesses. And so as a result, I think I'm now a better advocate now that I've sat on the other side of the bench from the one that I normally used to occupy. And it does test me when I sit as a judge. It tests my very essence and my knowledge as a lawyer and what I believe about justice. Because one has to be very careful when one sits in judgment, because justice has to be tempered with mercy. And therefore, in my interview, one of the things they asked me was, what would I find hard about sitting as a recorder? And I said that I would find it very hard to put people in prison. There was a long pause, and I thought I'd blown that interview. And luckily for me, the senior judge, retired judge that was interviewing me, leaned forward and said, that's exactly the sort of recorder we want to appoint. And I try to live that when I sit as a judge. Well, traditionally, the clerks used to get 10% of a barrister's income.
Yeah.
So when I started as a pupil, the senior clerk would earn twice as much as the QCs were earning, because we had 20 silks in chambers, and the senior clerk would earn therefore 10% of 20 people's income, and so he was on twice the average income of a silk. But they didn't mind, because every case they got was brought in by that clerk, who was a legend amongst clerks. And Michael Greenaway was a name that even now all the senior clerks know. And for some reason, Michael took me under his wing, which is why I got such great work as a pupil.